The Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference occurs once every 5 years, and in May in 2010, it will be the 8th conference that will have occurred since the beginning of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And its purpose is to assess how well the provisions of the Non-Proliferation Treaty have been implemented and to chart a path forward for those issues that have not been properly addressed. At the meeting are all states that are party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, although observers are also welcome. The signs of the non-proliferation regime's ailments are evident. In the last decade alone, we have North Korea withdrawing from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and conducting 2 nuclear tests. We have concerns about Iran's nuclear ambitions. We have Syria possibly constructing a reactor without informing the International Atomic Energy Agency. And then we also have the threat from non-state actors, such as the AQ-Khan illicit network and also al-Qaeda's declarations of trying to also seek and use nuclear terrorism. These developments have contributed to a regime suffering a crisis of confidence. Next month's Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference is an opportunity for all states that are party to it to stabilize and strengthen the non-proliferation regime. Understanding what the purpose of the review conference is important. For instance, this is not an opportunity to solve the concerns we have about Iran or North Korea's compliance with its non-proliferation obligations. But it is, however, an opportunity for states that are party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty to create or strengthen new rules to deal with issues of states that may be cheating from within the regime and then may choose to withdraw in the future. Without a doubt, the United States is an important player in stabilizing and strengthening the non-proliferation regime. The U.S.'s approach has definitely changed since President Obama took office, and he signaled many of the elements of his agenda when he gave a landmark speech in Prague in April of 2009. And since then, we've seen several different things happen, including his chairing of the UN Security Council in September of 2009, the conclusion of the New START agreement between the United States and Russia, which was recently signed. We also have the Nuclear Posture Review, which is an expression of the role and purpose of nuclear weapons for the United States for the next 5 to 10 years. And most recently, we've seen this Nuclear Security Summit that President Obama hosted, which was an attempt to secure vulnerable materials around the world and prevent nuclear terrorism. So looking at all of these elements, there are people who ask, well, what is this review conference? And there may be a tendency to look at it and say that this is the next chance to see how well the president has done in implementing the agenda he set out in Prague. But I think to do that is to look at it too narrowly. And the president said this himself. In Prague, in his speech there, he said, the United States can lead this effort, but others will have to follow. And right now, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference is a real opportunity to see whether other states see stabilizing and strengthening the non-proliferation regime as the joint endeavor it actually is. Traditionally, the NPT Review Conference operates using universal consensus rules. What that means is that if there is a document, usually called a final declaration, that captures the consensus of the proceedings, every single state has to agree to it. What that means is that any one state can stand up and say no. And that way, all states are really important for what will happen in the conference. This is not just about the nuclear weapon states that are the permanent members of the UN Security Council, nor is it just about the non-aligned movement and some of the key voices there. Every state will have an opportunity to contribute if that's what they want to do. That said, there are a set of key states that take leadership positions and are important to watch. They include, from the nuclear weapon states perspective, the 5 members of the Security Council, so the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China. What's been interesting to see is that there's always a lot of emphasis and focus on what the United States is doing. I think non-nuclear weapon states could advance their causes of disarmament if they also focused a little more equitably amongst the other nuclear weapon states, including China and Russia. Other key non-nuclear weapon states include members of the non-aligned movement. So Egypt, for instance, is the chair of the non-aligned movement and will be trying to coordinate a statement from them. But Indonesia, Singapore, kind of more moderate voices will also be important. South Africa traditionally has played a very important role in trying to broker agreements and serve as a bridge between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. And then outside of the NOM, you have key states like Brazil. Brazil is an observer to the non-aligned movement, but has a lot of different interests at play in the discussions that will happen, and so that'll be another key country to watch. In recent times, there has been an increasing common understanding that the Non-Proliferation Treaty has three pillars. Those pillars are disarmament, non-proliferation, and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. In recent years, there's been increasing agreement that there needs to be a balanced approach to the issues that are captured in those three pillars. I think that we'll likely see that, but there are some issues that are bound to be contentious. One, for instance, is the 1995 Middle East Resolution. This was an agreement that states had adopted in 1995 when the question ahead of the states party to the treaty was whether to indefinitely extend it. They agreed to indefinitely extend the treaty, but only if some of these other items were done. And the conclusion and entry into force of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was one part of the package. But the 1995 Middle East Resolution, creating a zone free of weapons of mass destruction, was another key component. For some states in the region, this is a bone of contention because they feel that not enough has been done since 1995, so in 15 years, to show any real progress. This will definitely be a key issue to watch, and whether there are some small concrete steps that states can agree to show that there's some forward momentum on this issue. Another issue where there may be some disagreement is on progress on disarmament and how to chart a path forward. And although there are some nuclear weapon states that will have a lot to show for what they've done, whether it's enough or not for non-nuclear weapon states will really be the big question. And moving forward and understanding kind of the complexity of the security environment today and into the future and how that relates to nuclear weapons policy, that may also be a problem in terms of charting a path forward. Another possibly contentious issue has to deal with the fuel cycle. In the past, there have been several proposals which have aimed to constrain which countries or the number of countries that can have access to enrichment or reprocessing technologies. These are the sensitive parts of the fuel cycle that can be used to also develop nuclear weapons material. Currently, though, all the proposals on the table are voluntary. But I think there's still a lot of bad feeling from previous efforts, and there's concerns from non-nuclear weapon states that nuclear weapon states or other developed states are trying to constrain what they see as their Article 4 rights under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the right to peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And here it's important for us to try to clear the table of these past proposals and to recognize that the Non-Proliferation Treaty does not confer the right to peaceful uses of nuclear energy to states. Instead, it acknowledges that all states have that right outside of the treaty. But what the NPT does say is that if you are a state that wants to develop a civilian nuclear energy program and you want cooperation from other states to do so, you have to sign up for a few conditions. For instance, comprehensive safeguards agreements where the International Atomic Energy is able to come in and ensure that those activities for civilian nuclear energy purposes are not being diverted towards a military nuclear weapons program. A final issue that will also be contentious is around Article 10 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the withdrawal clause. Since North Korea withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there are concerns about clarifying the process by which states do that, as well as the consequences for states withdrawing from the NPT if it is found that they were cheating while they were within the regime and used what they gained while they were party to the treaty for nuclear weapons purposes when they withdraw. Some states believe that, particularly in the non-aligned movement, believe that international law governs the interpretation of Article 10. There are other states that are not satisfied with that. They don't think there are in place appropriate consequences for cheaters who then try to later withdraw. Traditionally, success has been measured in what is called a consensus final declaration. In the previous 7 review conferences, there have only been 3 instances of a final consensus declaration being reached. In my opinion, I think too much time has been lost to actually gain a consensus final declaration that is in any way meaningful for this review conference. Although that is the preferred outcome, and I hope that I'm wrong, I think that states will have to be a little more politically entrepreneurial in terms of determining what are alternative measures of success. What will be important is the day after the review conference. How do states forestall any declarations that the Non-Proliferation Treaty is dead or that the regime is failing? And I think one way of doing that is to point to any of the different examples for showing that there is positive momentum coming out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference to stabilize and strengthen the regime. Aside from a consensus final declaration, there are a few other ways in which to measure success. One, for instance, is in the statements that states may make either individually or in groupings that may be regional or may be an interesting group of states that have gotten together in the past, such as the 7 Nation Initiative, the Vienna Group of 10, or the New Agenda Coalition, or any new groupings that may appear. In these statements, they can do several things. One is they can take any of the individual issues that will be addressed, for instance, universalization of the additional protocol. Let's say there is a state that has not adopted the additional protocol, but they can announce their intention to do so. That's a good news story to show that there are states that are committed to taking on these kinds of measures in order to strengthen the regime. Another way of showing success is if there is a coordinated statement from the nuclear weapon states. So this would be a P5 statement. That, from my research, I have found that non-nuclear weapon states find that to be very meaningful if the nuclear weapon states can find some common ground or common expression of what their plan is and what their approach is to dealing with today's problems in the non-proliferation regime. For particularly tricky issues, such as Article 10, the withdrawal clause, I think it will be very difficult to come to agreement at this review conference about consequences or for cheaters who then try to withdraw from the regime, or even on process of what to do if there is a state that says that it does want to withdraw, and clarifying what that process is. There are currently several proposals that are out there, and I think one way of showing progress is if there was a set of states that said that they would take leadership after the review conference to assess those proposals, to go out to other countries, solicit their views, see if there were new proposals, and then to come back with some kind of assessment of what should be done for the next preparatory committee meeting or even the next review conference. That might be a way to show that states are committed to strengthening the non-proliferation regime. Another measure of success is slightly more oblique, and that is how are would-be spoilers treated? For instance, in the case of Iran, they have largely relied on the support of the non-aligned movement for their narrative that they have done nothing wrong and that the charges of non-compliance against them in the UN Security Council resolutions are just part of the United States and Western powers trying to oppress Iran. In light of last fall's revelation of a second secret enrichment facility that the Iranians had built, it'll be interesting to see what the reaction is of the non-aligned movement at the NPT review conference. Will they accept this narrative, or will they treat it with skepticism? If it's the latter, that can be very helpful for signaling to the Iranians that it's best that they change the course that they're on and come back to the negotiating table. And that way, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference can connect back to the negotiations that are currently happening, or the discussions happening between the major powers and Iran. Without a doubt, Iran will be an important country to watch at the review conference. They are actually slated to be the chair of the non-aligned movement for the 2015 NPT review conference. In the past, they have signaled that as long as there aren't efforts to name or shame Iran, they generally stay quiet. But that may be a hard scenario to build around, as there is this current thrust for sanctions in the UN Security Council. If that happens before the NPT review conference, I think we can expect to see an Iran that is less likely to be cooperative. If the sanctions effort waits until June, then maybe there's a little bit more room to play with in terms of what Iran is likely to behave as. Over the last few years, and particularly with the failure of the 2005 Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, there's been a tendency by some to call 2010 a make or break moment. And I think that this is a real mistake. One is because the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, it is an important part of the regime, but it is just part of the broader regime. The reality is that the day-to-day functioning of the non-proliferation regime occurs in a variety of other forums, such as the IAEA Board of Governors, the UN Security Council, in the Nuclear Suppliers Group, in the Conference on Disarmament, in other UN bodies as well. And also, of course, in the policies that states choose to take up themselves in their bilateral relations with one another and even multilaterally. But the review conference is an important opportunity to give voice to the vast majority of states that are otherwise disenfranchised from many of these key decision-making forums. For instance, very few states are at any given time, one of the 10 members of the UN Security Council that do not have a veto power. They may not be one of the 35 members of the IAEA's Board of Governors. They may not be one of 46 members of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, or even one of 65 members of the Conference on Disarmament. And although the UN General Assembly and the First Committee have more universal representation, decision-making in those forums have been largely marginalized. So therefore, for the nearly 190 states that are party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, at any given time, they don't actually have a voice on key issues, except for once every 5 years. And as the future and fate of the non-proliferation regime really depends on the decisions many of these non-nuclear weapon states will make in the future, to me it seems worth engaging them in one of the few forums they deem legitimate, and that is the review conference.